Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to talk about some of the books I might read in April. There are two really wonderful bookish events in which I plan to participate. The first is April Adventures, hosted by Denson over on the pretty new channel Robin Song Reads. This booktube event encourages us to both read about adventures and have some adventures. If you haven't discovered his videos yet, I encourage you to check him out. He's a young man who reads widely and is also a musician. His videos always put me in a good mood, too. The second booktube event I want to talk about is People April, a readathon that encourages us to indulge in books focused on people's lives, and is hosted by some of my longtime favorite booktubers, Roz at Scowlydambling About the Books, Elisabeth at Bookwins and Books, and Brian at Bookish. Since I especially love to read both biographies and memoirs, as well as letters and diaries, especially of writers and artists and composers, etc., this readathon is an absolutely ideal reading event for me, and one I know I look forward to every year. In fact, the event is so perfect for me that I actually celebrate it every month, not just during April. First, let me talk about the prompts for April Adventures. There are three. The first is to read an adventure book, one where the character is taking some kind of genuine risk along the way, or where something could go wrong. The second is to take a bit of a personal reading adventure, to read a book outside your wheelhouse or normal rotation of favorite genres. And the third is to have an adventure of your own, which Robin Song Reads defines quite broadly, to meet the needs of all his viewers, no risks required. Today I'm just going to respond to the first prompt, and I will save the next two for another time. I have three books in mind for this prompt, the prompt to read an adventure book, with three very different kinds of adventures. The first is Rick Steves' book on the Hippie Trail, Istanbul to Kathmandu and the Making of a Travel Writer. For many years, I have known the travel guides and lovely travel-oriented television shows by Rick Steves. He's also the author of Travel as Political Act that came out not too long ago, maybe 2017 or 18, where he explains that travel is an antidote to xenophobia. But his new book, On the Hippie Trail, is a different kind of adventure. This book was an account of his earliest travels as a very young man in the 1970s, when he and many other Americans and Europeans explored countries and communities in West and South Asia in what some people call alternative tourism. People were trying to travel for as long as they could before their money ran out, and therefore they tried to travel as inexpensively as possible. Partly to save money, and partly as a goal in itself, these travelers were interested in getting to know the people who lived in these areas and the cultures, more than a lot of Western tourists of that era did. I haven't read Paul Theroux's book, The Great Railway Bazaar, but I gather it's a train-based version of the Hippie Trail adventure. For those of you who grew up in the digital age, this might not seem quite as adventurous as it seemed at the time, when many Westerners really had very limited knowledge or contact with the world outside of the US or Northern Europe, especially if they were not wealthy or if they had not been in military service. Anyway, Steve's book recounts his trip and includes photographs of his handwritten journals, as well as some wonderful photographs. When I talk about this after reading it, I'll show you. One of the things I have not said yet in this discussion is that my brother has long been really fascinated by the history of the Hippie Trail, and he's already read this book, I think. I'm thinking about asking him to join me here for a discussion of the book. But to be honest, he is currently having a couple of very exciting adventures of his own and might be a bit too busy. The second adventure book I have in mind is sort of a hybrid, written by a professional travel writer, but actually about an adventure not out in the world, but a personal kind of adventure to understand oneself. The book is called Conundrum by the great author Jan Morris. First, let me say that Morris was quite an adventurous travel writer, climbing mountains and crossing deserts, etc. I have a collection of her writing, The World, Life and Travel, 1950 to 2000, which I might poke into again during April Adventures. But Conundrum is a very different kind of book. This is her account of choosing to undergo gender transition at a time when gender transition was not widely talked about. She talks about her decision to live openly as a woman after decades of living as a, quote, manly man. I'm quite intrigued by this book, especially because of its place in the historical record as one of the first memoirs about gender transition. Let me read to you from one of my favorite reviews, arguing that Conundrum is one of the best first-hand accounts ever written by a traveler across the boundaries of sex. All right, the third adventure book I want to talk about is a little more mellow. This book is Raising Hair, a memoir by Chloe Dalton. I mentioned this in one of my forthcoming books videos, I think, and a lot of people in booktube are talking about this book, which I'm thrilled to see taking off in the bookish world. At its most basic, this is the story of a woman who brings a baby hare into her house, takes care of it as it grows, and yet chooses not to make it a pet. Her initial intention is for the hare to return to the wilderness, but they create a relationship of companionship. Dalton is putting herself in a place of risk, one of those adventure requirements. Her risk is a private internal one, where she has to balance between loving this animal and yet allowing it to remain free, including free to leave. I'm really looking forward to finishing this one. All right, these are 3 adventure books I'm planning to read for April Adventures, but these choices might sound really familiar to you. All 3 of these were on the initial possibilities list for the group read for the other big reading event in which I'm going to be participating, People April. And Dalton's Raising Hair pulled ahead of the poll and was chosen to be the group read. But since I feel like I am double dipping for this DBR, I think I'll mention another set of 3 books that might work for People April. Although honestly, these books could be spun to work for April Adventures too, I think. The first one is Cold Kitchen, A Year of Culinary Journeys by Caroline Eden. This is not the author's first book. I have checked out her cookbook Samarkand from the library I don't know how many times. There are lovely illustrations in that book, short essays about her time traveling and eating along the Silk Road, and beautiful recipes that I had dreamed about but not actually cooked yet. But Cold Kitchen is more of a memoir with a few recipes, as opposed to a cookbook with a few memoir-esque essays in it. She's writing while she's back home in Scotland, and remembering the foods from her travels, but also the items she's brought back home with her and incorporates into her life, from embroidered napkins to bowls hollowed out from dried gourds. Her point is not dissimilar to Rick Steves' point in the Hippie Trail, that travel, especially when it is intentionally meant to connect with not just tourist sites, but with the people and cultures of the place one visits, can be eye-opening and heart-expanding. Okay, my next choice is Jean Strouse's biography of Alice James. Alice was the sister of the novelist Henry James and the philosopher-psychologist William James, and while Alice herself was a fairly prolific writer, her writing was predominantly in her letters and journals. Wiley Strouse, who published this book in 1980, has a new book published just last year, in other words, 45 years after her first book, about the relationship between the painter John Singer Sargent and the Wertheimer family, which would be great for Framed in September. At any rate, there are 2 themes that especially intrigue me about this book. One is the fact that Alice lived in what is sometimes called a Boston marriage. It was called a Boston marriage partly because of her own relationship, but also for the relationship that my beloved author Sarah Orne Jewett had with a woman in Boston. And of course partly because other women made the same kind of choice for a serious, committed relationship with another woman. Looking at these stories, we usually do not know if these kinds of relationships were sexual. In general, though, we do know that most of them were romantic in some way, depending on exactly what you mean by the term. It was not uncommon for women in such relationships across the country and over a period of several decades to have commitment ceremonies, wear each other's rings, etc. And in general, their friends treated them as a pair, inviting them to parties as a couple, etc. What they didn't do is treat them as if they were people violating some social restriction. Boston marriages were relatively accepted by society. The other part of this book that intrigues me is that Alice's life revolved around disability and illness. She experienced both psychological and physical ailments, and she died from breast cancer in 1892. In recent years, historians have turned their eyes to how cultural ideas about illness and disability have changed over time. And I'm interested in both the history and also the ways specific individuals who might have been atypical might have experienced mental and physical illnesses themselves, and how they made sense of their lives. I'm really looking forward to this book, but I'm also hoping to read Alice James' diaries and letters if I can track them down. On the back of the book is a blurb from the critic John Leonard. Strouse has written a Jamesian novel, subtle, evasive, embroidered, and splendid. Sounds good to me. The next book I want to mention is related to that biography. It's called American Breakdown, Our Ailing Nation, My Body's Revolt, and the 19th-Century Woman Who Brought Me Back to Life by Jennifer Lunden. After moving from Canada to Maine at the age of 21, Lunden became quite ill, having trouble standing for more than just a few minutes, and even having trouble holding up a book. One of her doctors suggested that she was just depressed, and others really didn't know what to say, which is still remarkably common, especially in the case of chronic illness. After 5 years of ill health, she stumbled upon a biography of Alice James, Jean Strauss's biography, which she found something of a comfort. In this book, she braids together her own experiences with the life that Alice lived. And I gathered that she talks about the impact of the Industrial Revolution and late-stage capitalism on health. While I admit that I am quite skeptical of easy and personal answers about larger historical questions in general, and about healthcare in specific, I will say that this book is really up my alley. As regular viewers already know, for personal reasons I'm a little obsessed with memoirs about cancer and other illnesses, and also that I'm really drawn to author biographies as well as books about personal meanings of reading. This seems like a mashup of all three. Let me read one pub blurb to you. A silent spring for the human body. This wide-ranging, genre-crossing literary mystery interweaves the author's quest to understand the source of her own condition with her telling of the story of the chronically ill 19th-century diarist Alice James, ultimately uncovering the many hidden health hazards of life in America. Both of these booktube events are wonderful, and I would love for you to join in. My apologies for my somewhat late TBR. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.